Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Lord's Day Holy Reading time. It's nice to have you with us, and we're ready to get started.
All right, welcome everybody. Glad you can make it. We're on the second two of Walking with God with Jeremiah Burroughs, and we're going to finish up the chapter here today, Lord willing, 12 Rules of Direction for Walking with God. We'll do 9, 10, 11, and 12. 9, 10, and 11 are all very short, and then 12 is pretty long. And the subject it deals with adding a reading at the end of reading point 12, a reading from Alexander Maclaren to expand and expand. Just an overview. 9 is, in a nutshell, labor to be spiritual in your solitary times. Number 10, let God's presence be more to you than all the world. 11, go on with resolution in the performance of holy duties, though you see nothing come of them, the present. Whatever you're expecting to come from them. And number 12, make good interpretations of all God's ways and dealings with you. Comment for number 11 is you see nothing coming from your holy duties. So he has them listed as rules. Again, rule number 9, labor to be spiritual in your solitary times. If you would walk with God, prize your solitary times much. And we all have solitary times, and we know how much vies for our attention in our solitary times, so I'm sure we can all improve on that. What he's talking about here, labor to be spiritual in them. Do not lose those times when there's none but God and you together. You who have much business in the world especially, what little use do you make of your solitary times? When you are alone, you don't know what to do. God needs to be careful to be very spiritual there. So in that setting, he says, now I am separated from the world. Now I have to deal with God and my own soul in a solitary time. Oh, let me improve this and get advantage by this. Oh, do not let me be quiet until I get some conversation with God. Those Christians who are spiritual in their solitary times will be very spiritual when they come into company, as we come together today. When Moses was alone with God on the mountain and came down to the people, his face shone, so to bear it. Certainly, those who are alone with God may not be Moses, my words, but those that are alone with God and are spiritual shine in holy conversation when they come down from the mountain, when they come to converse with others. And I thought I'd look around a little bit for some commentary on Moses, which was Exodus. In that instance of Moses going up the mountain, I got Matthew Henry, very insightful, about a page here on Exodus 4, verses 12 through 18. And it'll have some very good pointers and insights for us that relate to spending our solitary times and waiting on the Lord. Verses 12 through 18, chapter 24. And the Lord said unto Moses, come up to me into the mount, and be there. And I will give thee tables of stone, and a law, and commandments which I have written, that thou mayest teach them. And Moses rose up, and his minister Joshua, and went up into the mount of God. And he said unto the elders, tarry ye here for us until we come again to you. And behold, Aaron and Hur are with you. If he hath matters to do, let him come unto them. And Moses went up into the mount, and a cloud covered the mount. And the glory of the Lord abode upon Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered 6 days. And the 7th day he called, unto Moses out of, and the sight of the glory of the Lord was like devouring fire on the top of the mount in the eyes of the children of Israel. And verse 18, and Moses went into the midst of the cloud and gat him up into the mount, and Moses and 40 nights. Matthew Henry says, the public ceremony of sealing the covenant being over, Moses is called up to receive further instructions, which we have in the following verses. Number one, he has two main sections and some subsections, but the number one main section, he is called up into the mount, and there he remains 6 days at some distance. Orders are given him in verse 12, come up to the mount, that is, expect to continue there for some considerable time. Those that would have communion with God must not only come to ordinances, but they must abide by them. Blessed are those that dwell in his house, not that merely call there, just arrive there periodically or regularly. Quote, come up, and I will give thee a law, that thou mayest teach them. Moses taught them nothing but what he had received from the Lord, and he received nothing but what he taught them. For he was faithful both to God and did neither add nor diminish, but kept close to his instructions. Having received these orders, number one, subpoint, he appointed Aaron and Hur to be as Lord's justices in his absence, to keep the peace and good order in the congregation. Verse 14, the care of his government he would leave behind him when he went up into the mount, that he might not have that to distract his mind. And yet he would not leave the people as sheep having no shepherd. No, not for a few days. Good princes find their government a constant care, and their people find it a constant blessing. Point 2, he took Joshua up with him into the mount. Verse 13, Joshua was his minister, and it would be a satisfaction to him, to Moses, to have him with him as a companion during 6 days that he tarried. This out, that the 6 days were not part of the 40. That he tarried in the mount before God called to him. Joshua was to be his successor, and therefore thus he was honored before the people above the rest of the elders, that they might afterwards the more readily take him for their governor. And thus he was prepared for service by being trained up in communion with God. Joshua was a type of Christ, and, in parentheses, as the learned bishop observes, Moses takes him with him into the mount, in whom are hid all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. There is no looking into the secret, nor approaching the glorious presence of God. Number 3, a cloud covered the mount 6 days, a visible token of God's presence there. For he so shows himself to us as at the same time to conceal himself from us. He lets us know so much as to assure us of his presence, power, and grace, but intimates to find him out to perfection. During these 6 days, Moses stayed waiting upon the mountain. Verses 15 and 16, God thus tried the patience of Moses and his obedience to that command, going back to be there. Moses had been tired before the 7th day, as Saul was in 1 Samuel 13:8 and 1 Samuel 13:9. And I thought I'd go ahead and read. Sometimes we just reference the verses, but it's important to read these. 1 Samuel 13:8 and 13:9. So I'll start it a little earlier in 6. That they were in a strait, for the people were distressed. Then the people did hide themselves in caves and in thickets and in rocks and in high places and in pits. And some of the Hebrews went over Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. As for Saul, he was yet in Gilead, and followed him trembling. So this is comparing Moses with Saul and his response to not waiting. And he tarried, Saul, 7 days according to the set time that Samuel had. Samuel came not to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. And Saul said, Bring hither a burnt offering to me, and peace offerings. And he offered the burnt offering. So I'm reading beyond verse 9 a little bit. And it came to pass that as soon as he had made an end of offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. And Saul went out to meet him, that he might salute him. And Samuel said, What hast thou done? And Saul said, Because I saw that the people were scattered from me, and that thou camest not within the days appointed, and that the Philistines gathered themselves together at Michmash. Therefore said I, the Philistines will come down now upon me to Gilgal, and I have not made supplication unto the Lord. I forced myself, therefore, and offered a burnt offering. And Samuel said to Saul, Thou hast done foolishly. Thou hast not kept the God which he commanded thee. For now would the Lord have established thy kingdom on Israel forever, but now the kingdom shall not continue. The Lord hath sought him a man after his own heart, and the Lord hath commanded him to be captain over his people, because thou hast not kept that which the Lord commanded thee. So, a comparison with Saul there. If Moses had been tired before the seventh day as Saul, and had said, Why should I wait for the Lord any longer? He would have lost the honor of entering into the cloud. But communion with God is worth waiting for. And I underlined this. And it is fit we should address ourselves to solemn ordinances with a solemn pause, taking time to compose ourselves. And I think you can apply that to the Lord's table. On those days, thinking of the Lord's table before you actually get here, composing yourself, having your minds and hearts on that. And he references 108. Verse 1, O God, my heart is fixed. I will sing and give praise, even with my glory. Point number, or overall, Roman numeral 2, he is called into a cloud on the seventh day, probably on the Sabbath day. Verse 16, now, subpoint 1, the thick cloud opened in the sight of all Israel, and the glory of the Lord broke on fire. Verse 17, God, even our God, is a consuming fire. And so he was pleased to manifest himself in the giving of the law, that knowing the terrors of the Lord, we may be persuaded to obey, and may by them be prepared for the comforts of the gospel, and may be the more acceptable. Subpoint 2, the entrance of Moses into the cloud was very wonderful. Moses went into the midst. Verse 18, it was an extraordinary presence of mind which the grace of God furnished him with by his 6 days. Else he durst not have ventured into the cloud, especially when it broke out in devouring fire. So he was prepared. The Lord, in his wisdom, supernatural, divine wisdom, had Moses prepared because of that devouring fire which was going to come. Because of that, Moses was sure that he who called him would protect him. And even those glorious attributes of God which are most terrible to the wicked, the saints, with a humble reverence, rejoice. So the bottom line on that is Matthew Henry says, he that walks righteously, rightly, is able to dwell, even with this devouring fire, as we are told in Isaiah 33:14 and 33:15. I had a little side note. He has a clean conscience. You know, he walks righteously and speaks uprightly. To me, that means that's related to that, to me. There are persons and works that will abide the fire, 1 Corinthians 3:12, etc., and some that will have confidence before God. Point 3, and finally, his continuance in the cloud was no less wonderful. He was there 40 days and 40 nights. The 6 days were not part of 40, for during those 6 days Moses was with Joshua, who did eat of the manna and drink of the brook, mentioned in Deuteronomy 9:21, and while they and drink with him. But when Moses was called into the midst of the cloud, he left Joshua without, who continued to eat and drink daily while he waited for Moses' return. But thenceforward Moses fasted. Doubtless God could have said what he had now to say to Moses in one day, but for the greater solemnity of the thing, he kept him with him in the mount 40 days and 40 nights. We are hereby taught to spend much time in communion with God and to think that time best spent, which is so spent. Those that would get the knowledge of God's will must meditate thereon day and night. Matthew Henry. Rule number 10, let God's presence be than all the world. Underlined. Count it more attractive to your soul to be with God and to have God's presence with you than if you had the eye of all the world upon you. And that really speaks volumes today with everybody clamoring to get the eye of the world upon them, and they have the technology to do it. It would mightily count it more attractive to your soul to be with God and to have God with you than if you had the eye upon you in your pride. It would mightily compose women if they had an awful AWEFUL reverence of the presence of God and counted it more than all the world besides. Therefore, do nothing in God's presence but what you would do of all the world, or what you may do without your conscience accusing you for it. Underlined, oh, look upon the presence of God as more than all the world to you. Rule 11, go on with a resolution in the performance of holy duties, though you see nothing come of them for the presence. Though you see nothing come of them for the present. Though I do not have the comfort I wish, yet I am doing what duty I am commanded. I am still in God's way, and that should satisfy every gracious heart. And I totally agree with that. I mean, I've got a comment here in just a second. Though I do not have the encouragements I wish, yet I am in God's way. Let me keep in that way of God. I looked up encouragements, Matthew, 1828 dictionary. The act of giving courage or confidence of success, incitement to action or to practice. Well, if you're thinking you're not hearing from the Lord in a supernatural way, everything's in God's word for you to give you courage or confidence of success, or incitement to action or to practice. So though I do not have the encouragements I wish, yet profitably I am in God's way. Let me keep in that way of God. Rule 12, make good interpretations of all God's ways and dealings with you. How is your mindset with everything of God's providence? This is a mighty help to us to keep on in the way of God and to walk with him. If God comes in a way of affliction, make good interpretation of that affliction. Do not conclude that God appears like an enemy to you. That will discourage you. But look on God as, underlined here, intending good to you in everything. And we go back to the old standby here on my own, Romans 8:28, which to me is the ever-present maintaining peace of mind in all things. God, you have the option to maintain peace of mind in all things when God has shown you all that you need to know about everything working for your good in him. So, but God as intending good to you in everything, and that will help you to keep close to him and walk close to him in every condition. If God seems to go out of the way of prosperity and to come in the way of affliction, make good interpretations of it. Do not think, therefore, that God is leaving and forsaking you, underlined this, but exercise faith. You've got it, you have to exercise it. Believe that God intends as much good to you in that way as in any way whatsoever. I ground this rule upon the passage in Hebrews 12. In the former part of the chapter, the apostle speaks of God's chastening of his people. Despise not thou the chastening of the Lord, nor faint when thou art rebuked of him. For whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth and scourgeth every son whom he receiveth. And I looked kind of quickly at Webster's into chastening or chasten, scourge, and rebuke. And it's interesting, to me, just my opinion, it seems to me that rebuke is the easiest as far as severity. It's chide, check, restrain, heal, calm. It's very close to chasten. Chasten is to correct by punishment, to punish, to inflict pain for the purpose of reclaiming an offender. And scourge is punish with severity, and the actual word means to straighten. So you've reached a different level there if the Lord is scourging you. Then in the 7th verse, quote, if ye endure chastening, then God dealeth with you as with sons. What son is he whom the Father chasteneth not? But if ye be without chastisements, whereof all are partakers, then are he goes to the point of chastisements in verses 9 through 11, speaking of nothing but chastisements. Now in the 12th verse, he draws a conclusion from this, having laid this on the ground, that we are to look upon God as a father in chastisement. Quote, wherefore then lift up the hands which hang down and the feeble knees, and make straight paths for your feet, lest that which is lame be turned out of the way. It is as if he should say, quote, when you apprehend wrath against you and not in a way of love, your knees will be feeble and you will not be able to go on with that cheerfulness to walk with God in that hard way that he seems to be calling you to. But look at yourselves as sons, and look at God as underlined here, so that by chastisements you may be made partakers of his holiness. So that by chastisements you may be made partakers of his holiness. And how important is that? Lift up the hands that hang down and those feeble knees that you were unable to walk with God. Those feeble knees will be strengthened, underlined, if you make good interpretations of the ways of God. And my little note here, God has enabled you that option to make good interpretations of the ways of God and believe that the Lord intends good to you. This is also true of spiritual desertions, underlined. When God comes not only with outward afflictions, but with spiritual desertions, afflicting even your interpretations of them. You might say, that is when it's hardest to walk with God. Indeed, we might walk with God and keep on in communion with him, notwithstanding outward afflictions. But, my words here, added to withdraw himself both inwardly and outwardly, that's hard! Exclamation point. I will give you one notable scripture about a child of God who followed hard after God. God seemed to withdraw himself in both ways. In 63, David was in the wilderness of Judah when Saul persecuted him. Saul persecuted David and followed him, and David was forced to hide in the wilderness and move from place to place. Yet, mark his words, quote, O God, thou art my God. In parentheses, yet for all that I seek thee. So David's in the midst of this affliction and desertion. And he says, early will I, O God, thou art my God, early will I seek thee. My soul thirsteth for thee, my flesh longeth for thee, in a dry and thirsty land where no water is. Verse, my soul followeth hard after thee. That is, this is Jeremiah Burroughs' words. Though, Lord, thou seemest to withdraw thyself from me in regard to these outward administrations, still my soul follows hard after thee. Underlined, in times of affliction, when God seems to withdraw himself by his afflictions, our souls should still follow hard after God. Does God seem to go from us as if he would not walk with us? if that's the way he's seeming to you, run after him. If a child's mother gets away from him, the child will cry and run after her. So it was with David. When the Lord seemed to be going away, David said that his soul followed hard after him. Underlined. This is an excellent frame of spirit, that the more the Lord seems to be gone from a Christian, the harder the soul after God, or should. And my little note here is weaning you from all but him. Nothing can satisfy such a man but God himself, and therefore David says, my soul be in a dry land. He does not say after water, but after any affliction you can say this, Lord, it is not so much the deliverance from my affliction that my soul thirsts for, but Lord, thou knowest that my soul thirsts for thee. If the affliction is only made up in thyself, capital T, that will be sufficient. I never find my soul following more earnestly after thee than now in my time of affliction. And we'll expand on this through Alexander Maclaren. It's called A Father's Discipline, and it's from those verses that I read in Hebrews. And he has a little bit of an intro. I will read just the first part of that and then skip down to his main points. Hebrews 12:10. Few words of Scripture have been oftener than these laid as a healing balm on wounded hearts. They may be long unnoticed on the page, like a lighthouse in calm sunshine. But sooner or later the stormy night falls, and then the bright beam flashes out and is welcome. They go very deep into the meaning of life as discipline. That's one of his main points. The main thing about life is it's a discipline. They tell us how much better God's discipline is than that of the most loving and wise of natural parents, and they give that superiority as a reason for our yielding more entire and cheerful obedience to him than we do to such. Point 1, I would ask you to note first the grand, deep, general conception here firmly laid hold of life as only intelligible when as education or discipline. God corrects, chastens, trains, educates. That is the deepest word about everything that befalls us. Now, there are involved in that 2 or 3 very obvious thoughts, which would make us all calmer, nobler, and stronger if they were vividly and vitally present to us day by day. The first is that all which befalls us has a will behind it and is cooperant to an end. Life is not a heap of unconnected incidents, like a number of links flung down on the ground, but the links are a chain, and the chain has a staple. It is not a law without a lawgiver that shapes men's lives. It is not a blind, impersonal chance that presides over it. Why, he's speaking of something going on right then in his life. Why meteors that astronomers expect in autumn to be flying and flashing through the sky in apparent wild disorder all obey our lives in like manner, are embodied thoughts of God's, in as far as the incidents which befall in them are concerned. We may mar, we may fight against, may contradict the presiding divine purpose, but yet behind the wild dance of flashing and transitory lights that go careening all over the sky, there guides not an impersonal power, capital P, but He, capital W, capital H, not it. He, not they, meaning God, men, circumstances, what people call second causes, he corrects, and he does it for a great purpose. Ah, if we believe that, and not merely set it from the teeth outwards, but if it were a with us, do you not think our lives would tower up into a nobleness and settle themselves down into a tranquility, all strange to them today? But then further there is the other thought to be grasped, that all our days we are here in a state of the world is God's nursery. There are many mansions in the Father's house, and this earth is where he keeps the little ones. That is the true meaning of everything that befalls us. It is education. Work would not be worth doing if it were not. Life is given to us to teach us how to live, to exercise our powers, to give us facilities of working. We are like boys in a training ship that lies for the most of the time in harbor, and now and then goes out upon some short and easy cruise, not for the sake of getting anywhere in particular, but for the sake of exercising the lads in seamanship. There is no meaning worthy of us, to say nothing of God, in anything that we do, unless it is looked upon as schooling. We all say we believe that. Alas, I am afraid very many of us forget it. The conception of the meaning of each event that befalls us carries with it the conception of the whole of this life as being an education towards another. I do not understand how any man can bear to live here and to do all his painful work unless he thinks that by it he is ready for the life beyond, and that nothing can bereave him of the force he made his own here. The rough ore is turned into steel by being plunged into baths of hissing tears, and heated hot with hopes and fears, and battered with the shocks of doom. And then, what then? Is an instrument thus fashioned and tempered and polished destined to be broken and, quote, thrown as rubbish to the void? If this life is education, as is obvious upon its very face, then there is a place where we shall exercise the faculties that we have acquired here, and manifest in loftier forms the characters which here we have made our own. Now, brethren, if we carry these thoughts with us habitually, what a difference it will make upon everything that befalls us. You hear men often maundering and murmuring about the mysteries of the pain and sorrow and suffering of this world, wondering if there is any loving will, capital W, behind it all. This is one of the best insights right here. That perplexed questioning goes on the hypothesis that life is meant mainly for enjoyment or for material good. Those questions about the suffering, pain, and sorrow of the world. That perplexed question goes on the hypothesis that life is meant mainly for enjoyment or for material good. That everything that is going on now and temporally is what matters. If we once apprehended in all applicable range this simple truth, that life is a discipline, we should have less difficulty in understanding what people call the mysteries of providence. Not say it it would interpret everything, but it would interpret an immense deal. It would make us eager, as each event came, to find out its special mission and what it was meant to do for us. So everything that comes at us in our life, when we look at it in that context, we may have temporarily some human frustrations and limited setbacks, but if we look at it in that context as the Lord in His providence, dealing with us in His providence, I think He makes a great point. Eager, as each event came, to find out its special mission and what it was meant to do for us. It would dignify trifles and bring down, I underline this, and bring down the overwhelming magnitude of the so-called great events. And, memorializes all of them and makes great to-do about them. All of these small things in people's lives and Christians' lives are just as great, if not greater. Ourselves and lords of circumstances and ready to wring the last drop of possible advantage out of each thing that befell us. Life is a father's discipline. Point 2, note the guiding principle of that discipline. They, as seemed good to them. Talking about temporal parents. I have already said that even in the most wise and unselfish training by an earthly parent, there will mingle subjective elements, peculiarities of view and thought, as what we might say subjectiveness in our humanness, and sometimes of passion and whim and other ingredients, which detract the value of all such training. The guiding principle for each earthly parent, even at the best, can only be his conception of what is for the good of his child, and oftentimes that is not pure, is not purely the guide by which the parent's discipline is directed. So the text turns us away from all these incompletenesses and tells us, quote, He for our profit, the perfect parent, with no sidelong look to anything else, and with an entirely wise knowledge, the result will be always and only for our good. This is the point of view from which every Christian man ought to look upon all that befalls him. It follows this plainly: there is no such thing as evil except the evil of sin. All that comes is good, of various sorts and various complexions, but all generically the same. The inundation, I like this, the inundation comes up over the fields and men are in despair. It goes down, and then, like the slime left from the Nile in flood, there is better soil for the fertilizing of our land. Storms keep sea and air from stagnating. All that men see evil in the material world as evil has in it a soul of good. That is an old commonplace, but like the other one of which I have been speaking, it is more often professed than realized, and we need to be brought back to the recognition we ordinarily are. If it be that all my life is a paternal discipline and that God makes no mistakes, then I can embrace whatever comes to me and be sure that in it I shall find that which will be for my good, even if you don't see it at first. So when things go well, obviously. But surely when the night falls, is the time for the stars to shine. When you hunker down with the Lord and believe Him, believe it's for your good. Gracious word should shine upon some of us in today's perplexities and pains and disappointments and sorrows. Again, quote, He for our profit. Now, that great thought does not in the least deny the fact that pain and sorrow and so-called evil are very real. There is no false stoicism in Christianity. The mission of our trouble will not be affected unless they did trouble us. The good that we get from a sorrow would not be realized unless we did sorrow. Weep for yourselves, said the Master, and for your children. It is right that we should writhe in pain. It is right that we should yield to the impressions that are made. I think he meant pain there. It said, it is right that we should writhe in palm, P-A-L-M. So I think maybe he meant pain. It is right that we should yield to the impressions that are made upon us by calamities. But it is not right that we should be so affected as that we should fail to discern in them this gracious thought for our profit. God has many love tokens, great and the little annoyances and pains that beset our lives, and on each of them, if we would look, we should see written in His own hand, capital H, this inscription, for your good. Do not let us have our eyes so full of tears that we cannot see or we cannot accept that sweet, strong message. The guiding principle of all that befalls us is God's unerring knowledge of what will do us good. That will not prevent and is not meant to prevent the arrow from wounding, but it does wipe the poison off the arrow and diminish the pain and should diminish the tears. And lastly, Roman numeral 3, here we see the great aim of all this discipline. The earthly parent trains his son or daughter for earthly occupations. These last a little while. God trains us for an eternal end. Quote, that we should be partakers of His holiness, unquote. The one object which is congruous with a man's nature and is stamped on his whole being as its only adequate end is that he should be like God. Holiness is the scriptural shorthand expression for all that in the divine nature which separates God from and lifts Him above the creature. And in that aspect of the word, the gulf between us and Him, in that context. But it also is the expression for the moral purity and perfection of that divine nature which separates Him from the creatures far more really than do the metaphysical attributes of infinitude and eternity. And in that aspect, the great hope that is given to us is that we may rise nearer to that perfect whiteness of purity, and though we cannot share in his essential, changeless being, we may walk as befits our limited and changeful natures in the light, quote, walk in the light as befits his boundless and eternal being is in the light. So again, that's that verse. We may walk in the light as he is in the light. That is the only end which it is worthy of a man, being what he is, to himself as the issue of his earthly experience, the Son. If I fail in that, whatever else I have accomplished, I fail in everything. I may have made myself rich, cultured, learned, famous, refined, prosperous, but if I have not at least begun to be like God in purity and will and heart, has missed the purpose for which I was made, for which all the discipline of life has been lavished upon me. Fail there, and wherever you succeed, you are a failure. Succeed there, and wherever you fail, you are a success. That great and only worthy end may be reached by the ministration of circumstances and the discipline through which God passes us. These are not the only ways by which he makes us partakers of his holiness, as we all know. There is the work of that divine Spirit who is granted to every believer to breathe into him the holy breath of an immortal and incorruptible life. Incorruptible. To work along with these, there is the influence that is on us by what he's been talking about, the circumstances in which we are placed and the duties which we have to perform. These may all help us to be nearer and liker to God. That is the intention of our sorrows. They will wean us, they will refine us, and they will blow us to his breast, capital H, as a strong wind might sweep a man into from itself. I am sure that among my hearers there are some who can thankfully attest that they were brought nearer to God by some short, sharp sorrow than by many long days of prosperity. What Absalom, in his wayward, impulsive way, did with Joab is like what God sometimes does with his sons. Joab palace, so Absalom set his corn on fire, and then Joab came. Great line. So God sometimes burns our harvests that we may go to him. So God sometimes burns our harvests that we not only will go to him. But the sorrow, and closing here the last couple of paragraphs, but the sorrow that is meant to bring us nearer to him may be in vain. The same circumstances may produce opposite effects. I dare say there are people listening to me now who have been made hard, sullen, and bitter, and paralyzed for work because they have some heavy burden or some wound that life can never heal, to be carted or to aid. Ah, brethren, we are often like shipwrecked crews, of whom some are driven by the danger to their knees, some are driven to the spirit casks. Take care that you do not waste your sorrows. Take care that you do not waste your sorrows, that you do not let the precious gifts of disappointment, pain. Isn't that amazing? Take care that you do not waste your sorrows, that you do not let the precious gifts of disappointment, pain, loss, loneliness, ill health, or similar afflictions that come into your daily life mar you instead of mending you. See that they send you nearer to God, and not that they drive you farther from him. See that they make you more anxious for riches and righteousness from you than to grasp at what may yet remain of fleeting earthly joys. And finally, so brethren, let us try to school ourselves in the habitual and operative conviction that life is discipline. Let us yield ourselves to the unerring Father, the perfect love, underlined. Let us beware of getting no good. Let us beware of getting charged to the brim with good. And let us see to it that out of the many fleeting circumstances of life we gather and keep the eternal fruit of being partakers of his holiness. May it never have to be said, excuse me, let me end right there. And let us see to it that out of the many fleeting circumstances of life, we gather and keep the eternal fruit of being partakers of his holiness. Alexander Maclaren on Hebrews 12. And I will wait till next week to close out Psalm 119. One section left, but we'll do that next week. Lord willing, we will close out of Walking with God with an objection. Chapter 9, an objection concerning God's hiding his face. It's worth coming back to listening to. So, willing. See you then.
Amen, and thank the Lord. And everyone on the line, we're glad you could join us. Excuse me, and go in a trust in God and the providences he brings. And Lord willing, we'll talk again soon.